Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and thank you all, everybody, for joining us today. Of course, this is a very important topic. It's a topic that affects all of us, subhanAllah, on an individual level as well as um, on a community level, as our beloved Sheikh had mentioned. Inshallah, today we'll briefly go through a few items on the agenda. The first is we'll have a bit of a holistic overview of what domestic violence is, some of the signs to identify it, and some of the conceptions around domestic violence, um, and also some of the causes, as our Sheikh had mentioned. We'll also talk about some of the legal issues and the implications that we see in the community, and I've experienced having worked in this field for quite some time. And we'll also talk about some of the services that are available to assist any person that is experiencing domestic violence, or even persons who are alleged to have committed domestic violence. And if we have some time, maybe we'll also go through a scenario or a case study just to give an example of a person who has experienced some form of domestic and family violence and what assistance is available. Otherwise, we'll also have some time for questions, inshallah. So firstly, what we'll be talking about is understanding domestic violence, maybe digging a little bit deeper into some of the legal definitions of what it might be or what it might not be, some of the causes, the prevalence and the impact of it on individuals as well as children as well. So really, there is no single widely accepted definition of what domestic and family violence is. It's quite a broad term, but generally speaking, it can be any act or any sort of behavior that is violent inherently, or that is intimidating, or that is designed to control another person, or that is done with the intention of causing another person to fear for their physical or mental safety. The law, as it applies in Australia in particular, and more recently, in more recent times, it's been recognised to be a scourge on society, and it affects our community. It affects, I think, every community. No one is really immune from it. People from all backgrounds, all religions, and demographics, including Muslims. And as our Sheikh had mentioned, it affects our Ummah at large, not only on an individual level, but also on a community level, and also internally within the household, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam asks us to preserve. Some of the things we should also remember is that domestic violence, legally speaking, can involve, most of the time, it involves husband and wife in our experience. However, it can also have wider reaching implications. So if you're not legally married to somebody and you're residing with them, you're taken to be a de facto partner. The law recognizes that those people can also be the subject of domestic violence, and also it can impact the relatives. You might have experienced or seen somebody who has experienced violence from siblings, cousins, uncles, aunties, grandparents, and so on. And the law also extends very far, and it talks about how even people in caretaking responsibilities are seen to be in a domestic relationship, and also housemates. So if a person shares a accommodation with friends or family friends and that sort of thing, that also is covered by some of the domestic violence laws in Australia. The Duluth wheel, this is also called the power and control wheel. This is a diagram that has been created by a particular abuse intervention program many years ago. And what it does is it's designed to physically illustrate some of the various layers of domestic violence and how it manifests itself, and how certain perpetrators use various tactics to ultimately gain power and control in a relationship. Now, the wheel has some of its limitations, of course. It's quite simplistic. It isn't adapted to any particular person or any particular community, and it doesn't take into account a person's circumstances. However, as a maybe generalization or uh, or like a holistic view, it does give an indication of some of the patterns of behaviors that are oftentimes identifiable in common examples of domestic violence. And so here, some of the more obvious examples that are more apparent to us are those on the outer circle, such as the physical and the sexual violence that are oftentimes seen as more easily identifiable. There is of course the inner wheel, which uses spokes to represent some of the other abusive behaviors that are sometimes not as easily identifiable, which over time and with repetition can seriously become problematic. And they include things like using intimidation, using threats, using emotional abuse, using economic abuse, financial abuse. And so these are oftentimes seen as examples which are a bit more difficult to identify. And so the model really demonstrates that at the core of all of this, what a perpetrator sometimes seeks to achieve is power and control in a particular relationship. In terms of the causes of domestic violence, it's no two cases are ever the same. Every person is different, every household is somewhat different, and every cases are also different. The research does show that domestic violence is usually a learned behavior. In other words, people can learn to be violent from their household or from the community or society around them that might influence them. And when people grow up or witness domestic violence, they could in turn model the same sort of behaviors. With that being said, it is possible to unlearn behavior and break the cycle of abuse if a person is found in that particular cycle. And while people may learn to be abusive or become abusive as a result of upbringing, their surroundings, it is a choice at the end of the day, and it's something that, inshallah, can be addressed. And although certain factors oftentimes influence someone's likelihood that they will commit domestic violence or be, found in that cycle, really at the end of the day, as we are taught, there is no excuse. Some of the factors, again, as our Sheikh had mentioned, I think the Sheikh mentioned one of the first things was the nafs primarily, and that is, an individual decision-making thing. And there is, evidence to suggest that it's influenced by social norms or what a person perceives as gender roles or an individual's perception of how their behavior will be perceived by others in the community and what the consequences might be for their behavior. So, for example, some of these normalized perceptions are that, men, for example, inherently cannot control their anger. Or maybe there's an expectation that if a person has experienced it, that they simply pick up and leave the relationship. Or maybe there's a perception that a person who has experienced domestic violence is just exaggerating for other motives, for example. And as we know, of course, it's not universal. It occurs across all sort of communities and cultures. However, the research does show that, in particular, in some cultures where women are at crossroads of some sort of inequalities, the rates are somewhat higher. And as our Sheikh had mentioned, the rights and responsibilities within a household are sometimes blurred when it comes to a person's duties. And that is often due to culture, that is often due to society and the influence that society has had on the households. Poverty is another maybe a factor that can be seen to be influencing domestic violence. There is a link between financial hardship and the outcome of that, which is difficulty within their household. However, again, it's not necessarily the case in every sort of matter. There are many examples of people who have significantly wealthy and have abundant financial resources that are still finding themselves in these sort of experiences. And on the flip side, there are people who are suffering from poverty and difficulty and really do treasure their household and really do not let that sort of seep into their relationships and into their marriages. We also unfortunately do see instances, even within the Muslim community, of the use of drugs and of alcohol, unfortunately. And that goes without saying that these are things that can contribute to domestic violence. And also the family history. So if a person has been exposed to domestic violence as a child, again, not in all cases, but usually if a person is showing certain behaviors, those behaviors are usually learned from a young age and they later sort of manifest themselves. Again, every case is different and every person is different. There are many examples of individuals who have experienced violence or been exposed to it at a young age and then use that experience as a way of learning and prioritizing their family's safety in the future. So some of the statistics that are available, and there are no statistics that I was able to locate in relation to Muslim communities specifically. However, there are some statistics in relation to nationwide experiences of domestic violence. As we know, men and women can both be victims. However, what the statistics do show is that women, by far and large, are usually more so the victims or experience domestic violence from their partners. So, for example, in Australia, this particular study demonstrated that 1 in 6 women had experienced physical violence and 1 in 20 men. There's also another study which talks about the emotional sort of violence, and that showed that the numbers were even higher. It was 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 7 men. And also, it also shows that in more disadvantaged communities, such as the Aboriginal communities, those numbers are even higher. As our Sheikh had mentioned, that there is an impact, especially on children, and it's a significant impact as well. It's obviously our responsibility to protect our children from being exposed to domestic and family violence. It can, hugely impact their emotional, their psychological, and their physical well-being. And Sheikh had mentioned some examples of him having witnessed children becoming unstable as a result of being exposed to such settings. And so those impacts have short-term symptoms as well as long-term symptoms in terms of what the research has shown. And it's also important to note that it's not necessarily the case that that the children be a direct victim, for example, consistent beating or hitting and that sort of thing. But they can also be victim to exposure, witnessing it, hearing it, being in that particular setting also has very, very similar effects as being a primary victim. And so some of these short-term symptoms can be things like sleeplessness, anxiety, increased issues with aggression, maybe even school complaints and that sort of thing. And the long-term impacts really are health issues, physically as well as mentally, and it could even spiral into other consequences like them not being able to develop good relationships or friend circles and turn to drugs and alcohol and that sort of thing in some cases. So we're now going to move on to some of the legal issues and the implications. Not just talking about this stuff because I'm a lawyer and I like to talk about the law. It is important that we understand these particular issues because um, this is a way of preventing it from happening. Um, uh, Education is important. What the law says affects us in our day-to-day lives, and sometimes, being able to identify and know what the law talks about and how the law deals with these sort of matters is in and of itself a way of prevention, and shifts the focus away from dealing with this in other ways. Um, and so we should be aware of how the law affects our lives. So the first sort of area of law that we'll talk about is the criminal law. We'll also talk about um, AVOs, what they are and how they can be imposed. And we'll also talk about some of the family law consequences as well. So quite uh, simplistically, what the criminal law is in New South Wales and also across every state in Australia is a set of laws that exist to prevent people from committing crimes. And if they commit those crimes, they can be subject to criminal penalties at law. So some examples of the crimes that are recognised at law are things like assaulting somebody, intimidating somebody, damaging someone's property, and that includes things like animals or even jointly owned property, um, coercive control, uh, sexual assault, contravention of AVOs if there are AVOs in place, and in extreme cases, even things like murder and homicide. Just in terms of a general picture of how the criminal law process works, if it does unfortunately get to that particular stage, there usually typically is a police complaint that comes around, maybe from a person that's experienced domestic violence or even a person that's witnessed another person experience domestic violence. And the police will normally undertake an investigation. They might gather evidence through statements or through camera footage or some other way. And they'll decide whether, based off that evidence, that the conduct amounts to a criminal charge. And if so, they will file criminal charges in the court. The next step is they'll make a determination as to whether, until the case is finished in court, whether a person should be released to bail or whether they should be held in custody. And so bail are a set of conditions that a person is subjected to when they're on liberty. So if the police give a person bail, they'll be the subject to those conditions until the case is finished. If the police refuse a person bail, that person has the right to apply to the court to seek release's bail. Then the matter will go through the court process. There'll be a mention where a person might either plead guilty to having committed the offence or not guilty if they deny committing the offence. If a person pleads guilty, the next phase will be the sentencing phase, which is when the court will look at and decide whether a person should face any penalties and what those penalties should be. If a person pleads not guilty, that goes to the next phase, which is the defendant hearing phase, where the court will hear the evidence and hear from the persons involved to decide whether a person is guilty or not. And if that person is not guilty, the case is dismissed. If they are guilty, then it moves to the sentencing phase, which is when the court decides what penalties should be imposed. Now, this can be a lengthy process, and it's oftentimes months and months before these matters are dealt with. In some of the more serious cases, I'm talking like sexual assault and murder and those sorts of things, the process is even lengthier because there are much more case management issues that are involved. We won't necessarily go through all of these, but it's just a brief outline in terms of to inform you that these matters do take a lot of time to resolve and they're not easily resolvable overnight. Some of the possible outcomes that the court can impose if a person has been found guilty or pleads guilty to an offence. We've listed these here in order of least sort of serious to the most serious sort of outcome. So there are things like dismissal, which means that the case is dismissed and the person does not get any penalty. Maybe it might have been a very minor incident, and it gets a bit more serious. So there could be other things like conditional release orders, or community corrections orders. Those are just terms that are used to describe things like good behavior bonds. And as part of those good behavior bonds, a person might be directed to participate in supervision or in maybe domestic violence courses or programs, or to undertake counseling or referrals to a psychologist or other professional help. There could be other impacts like fines. And in the worst cases, the court can also impose imprisonment on somebody, in other words, send them to jail. Now, it's not necessarily the case that each matter is treated the same. There are a lot of things that the court will factor in when it makes these decisions. They'll look firstly, how serious is the incident? How objectively serious is what occurred here? Is it a minor incident or is it a very serious example of domestic violence? They'll also consider whether a person has remorse or not, whether they've pled guilty or not, whether they have a violent history. This might be a first-off incident, or it might be an ongoing pattern of violence that a person has, and they simply have not learned their lesson. Then they'll take into account, of course, a person's personal and subjective features in terms of any health conditions or mental health conditions they might have, their employment circumstances, their family circumstances, and so on. And whether they've undertaken any rehabilitation or steps to address the issues. For example, counselling or marriage counselling, and those sorts of things. And also, the court is concerned with the community perception and the expectations that a person, or how a person should be dealt with if they've committed these sort of offences. The next area of law we'll talk about is apprehended domestic violence orders, or ADVOs or AVOs. The terms are usually used interchangeably, but what it is, an AVO is a court order that is designed to restrict a person's behaviour. So the order has certain conditions on it, and the idea is that those conditions are supposed to address a risk that a person poses to another person. An AVO is not a criminal case, like a criminal charge, and it doesn't go on a person's criminal record. However, if a person breaches the AVO, that could result in a criminal charge. Some of the conditions that AVOs might have are listed over here. There's always a standard condition, which is the first condition, that a person does not assault a person or intimidate a person or damage property or harm an animal that belongs to a person. But depending on how serious the incident is or how serious the concerns are that the police have when they take out these AVOs, they can impose other conditions. So, for example, we've seen cases where households have been effectively broken up because the police have formed a view the incident is too serious and the risk is too high, that these husband and wife should not have any contact with one another, and they've separated them. They might even impose things like restrictions on being able to go within a certain number of meters of a person's place of residence or where they might work. So those are the more sort of typical examples. There are other examples where, for example, if there are children in a marriage, then the conditions could be that the parents be not able to contact each other except as per a parenting plan or a parenting order in relation to the children. This is a bit of an overview in terms of how the court process works with AVOs. Now, what's important to note about AVOs is the police usually apply for an AVO on behalf of a person if they have good reasons to do so, or if they've gathered evidence similar to a criminal investigation. But a person can also apply for an AVO privately. If the police are not assisting a person who would like to apply for an AVO, they have the option of making their own private application to the court as well. And the AVO sort of goes through this particular process when the police apply for an AVO, they apply for something called a provisional AVO, which is temporary until the case goes to court. At court, a person can either agree to the conditions or consent without making admissions to doing anything wrong, or they can oppose the AVO and have it determined by the court. And it goes through the interim stage and then the final stage, where at the final stage, the court will decide or the judge will decide based off the evidence if the AVO should either be dismissed or made into a final AVO. Now, the next area of law we'll talk about is the family law. Um, Family law broadly covers things like divorce, things like parenting issues, and also property settlement issues. So the family court in Australia can make something called a parenting order. That parenting order can have orders effectively that deal with a whole range of things in relation to children. For example, who has the primary custody or the parental responsibility or the decision-making power in relation to a child, who a child might live with primarily, how often that child gets to spend time with the other parent, how the parents communicate, whether they're allowed to, communicate by phone or whether open communication is fine, depending on the circumstances. Other things like the maintenance, the financial aspect of the maintenance of the child, any restrictions that they want to impose similar to AVOs, and also in more serious examples where a person has abducted a child or taken a child interstate, for example, the court has the power to make recovery orders to have that child returned to their primary place of residence. And in some cases, they can also impose orders in relation to overseas travel. This, unfortunately, we've seen a number of these cases in the community where a particular parent has attempted to isolate a child or remove a child from the country and take them to another country so that the other parent does not have access to the child. The court has the power, if that risk is there, the court has the power to impose something called a family law watch list order, which is something that prevents the airport officials from allowing that person to board a plane effectively. So why all this is important? It's because when the court considers what orders it should make, it will consider all of these things that are really what's in the best interest of the child. And so what the law says about what the best interests of a child are these primary 6 points. One of the most important things that they'll consider is if there is a history of domestic violence. And so if there is that history, they will have to take that into account to determine what's the most safe outcome for the child. Is the child at risk of physical violence, emotional violence, psychological violence, or abuse or neglect? That's usually one of the primary things they look at when they're determining whether the orders that they make are in the best interests of a child. Now, aside from the parenting aspect as well, we sometimes see matters that end up going to court in relation to property settlement. So where, a husband and wife, for example, are married and they jointly own a home or whatever it might be, they can't come to an agreement about who gets what percentage and so on. We have seen cases where the court will take into account if there's a history of domestic and family violence to determine what the property split should be. And usually that comes into play in two sort of ways. The first is what impact that violence had on a person's ability to contribute to the relationship or to the asset pool. So, for example, if a person was restricted from working, not allowed to work, not allowed to leave the home, that sort of thing, that will be taken into account. And the other way it's taken into account is in relation to the current and future circumstances of the individual. So if a person, for example, has experienced domestic violence and they require ongoing counselling or rehabilitation or financial assistance in relation to those issues, that is also factored into the equation in terms of how the property split should occur. Now, the law strongly encourages parents or people that are married to come to an agreement between themselves in relation to these issues, the parenting issues, as well as the property issues. The law does not encourage court intervention, and if they can safely come to these agreements between themselves, then that is always preferable, because it avoids the stress and the costs and the delays of having to go through that court process. If those processes, however, are not successful, then there is the court option that is also available. Typically speaking, though, this is the sort of general overview of how that process would work. The husband and wife, for example, might either through lawyers or through mediators have some discussions, try to come to a written agreement, and if they can't, they might attempt things like mediation through a accredited mediator, an independent third party that helps both sides come to an agreement if they can make that decision themselves. That mediator does not have the power to force a person into any particular agreement, but they can make suggestions and help them work together. If that is done, if it's by consent, that can be made into something called consent orders. If it's not agreed to, and if the parties are still sort of on opposite ends of the spectrum, then there could be a court application where there will be firstly an interim hearing where a judge might make a decision what's to happen in the temporary period until the case is finalized, and also ultimately a final hearing. If along the way they still cannot decide, a judge might be left with the decision to make on behalf of the parents who between themselves they cannot decide, so the judge will impose their order at the end of the day. Again, this is a very lengthy process, and it varies from case to case. It's never the same sort of process for each and every individual person. There's of course no shame in seeking help if you've either experienced domestic violence or if you know somebody that has. There's no shame in asking assistance from your family. There's no shame in asking assistance from your mashaykh, from your local masjid, and from all the other organizations that are available to you. And what we'll talk about here is, just broadly speaking, some of the other social support services and the legal support services that are available within for the community for assistance with these sort of matters. And most of them are, I think all of them are, they're free and they're accessible, and they're available. A lot of people don't know about them, so it's important that we know that these services are actually existent if you require them and if you get to the point where you really need some intervention there. So the social support services, they normally have services that offer counselling and referrals to people that are experiencing domestic violence. They have caseworkers that can help with things like getting hospital care or getting psychological care or counselling and that sort of thing. They can also assist with things like safety planning. If a person is making a decision to leave a relationship, for example, they can also assist with things like emergency housing for a person and their child. They can also assist with things like financial planning and Centrelink related issues as well. Transportation issues, dealing with the police or the authorities or the government and all those sort of difficult tasks when a person is really at that point of crisis in their life. So these are some of the contact numbers for some services that are available. The New South Wales Domestic Violence Line is a service that's available to women. There is also a men's line, which is quite similar, and it also offers mental health and relationship-related assistance. There's the Muslim Women Association, which offers referrals for counselling as well, housing, financial counselling, and other forms of advocacy. There's also the 1-800-RESPECT line, which is also available 24/7. And there is the Family Advocacy and Support Service for both men and women. And that service provides a wraparound social support for people. They offer a telephone service as well as a face-to-face in-person service at courts in Parramatta, Sydney, Newcastle, and Wollongong. So these are all some helpful services that we should all be aware of if it comes to the point where you require them. These slides can be made available, so you're more welcome to have these after the presentation, inshallah. There's also a range of free legal services if a person needs some legal advice about what the law says about this situation, either as a victim or either as a person that's been accused of domestic violence, if there's police intervention, for example. And these are some of the legal services that are available. So Law Access is it's a free government run service that's run by Legal Aid. They provide advice, legal information, and referrals over the telephone. The Legal Aid Domestic Violence Unit is a specialist unit that provides assistance in relation to AVOs and also family law related issues. The Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service, they work closely with the Legal Aid Domestic Violence Unit, and they assist with more so the social support side of things, but also with legal referrals. There is the New South Wales Victims Services organisation, which provides referrals for counselling and also financial assistance to victims that are the subject of a violent crime in New South Wales. There's also the Women's Legal Service. They provide advice, again, with a focus on family law, parenting, and domestic violence related issues. And the Law Society, which is the peak body in New South Wales that can provide you with referrals to solicitors or private solicitors with particular specialties as well. Again, these slides will be made available, so these numbers, inshallah, will be accessible to you. That's all I have to say in terms of the presentation. There is also a case study, but maybe I'll ask Brother Mahfouz. I know at the time is 11:45, and it seems like there's about 10 questions. Happy to maybe just make the slides available and go to the questions, or we can continue with the case study, whatever you think.
I think, brother, it's better we can start the Q&A. And of course, we will be circulating the slides to all the audiences. I mean, we have got quite a rich number of questions related to the discussion which you have already made.